There's a crisis unfolding in Canada right now. And most people outside the country, they have no idea how bad it actually is. Let me give you some numbers. In 2015, the average home in Toronto cost $622,000. Today, it's $1.1 million. In Vancouver, homes that were $800,000 a decade ago are now $1.3 million. Even in smaller cities like Halifax or Kitchener-Waterloo, prices have literally doubled in less than 10 years. And rents? Don't even get me started on rents. A one-bedroom apartment in Toronto that cost $1,400 a month in 2015 now costs $2,400. In Vancouver, it's $2,600. Even in Calgary, which used to be affordable, rents have surged 40% in just 2 years. But here's what makes Canada's situation unique. This isn't just a housing affordability crisis like you see in other countries. This is a crisis created by a deliberate policy choice, a choice that continued for years, even as the consequences became absolutely undeniable. Between 2016 and 2023, Canada admitted 2.5 million permanent residents. That's not even counting temporary residents, international students, temporary foreign workers. When you include them, Canada added over 3.5 million people in 7 years, to a country of 38 million people. Think about that for a second. That's a 9% population increase in less than a decade, almost entirely driven by immigration. To put it in perspective, it would be like the United States adding 30 million people in 7 years. Except it didn't happen gradually. It accelerated dramatically starting in 2022. And here's the critical part. While Canada was adding millions of people, housing construction collapsed. In 2023, Canada completed fewer new housing units than in 2006, despite having 6 million more people. You added demand at a historic rate while supply fell. The result? Exactly what basic economics predicts. Prices exploded, rents skyrocketed, and an entire generation got locked out of home ownership. So the question isn't whether Canada has a housing crisis. Everyone knows they do. The real question is this: did Canada create a crisis that can't be fixed? Did they break their housing market so thoroughly that no policy can repair it in any reasonable time frame? Let me show you the numbers, the policy decisions, and why this might be the most instructive case study in how not to manage immigration and housing policy. Before we can figure out if this is fixable, we need to understand exactly what happened. Let's look at the data year by year. In 2015, Canada had 35.7 million people. By 2023, 40 million. That's 4.3 million people added in 8 years, a 12% increase. But the growth wasn't evenly distributed. From 2015 to 2019, Canada grew by about 350 to 400,000 per year. That was fast by historical standards, but manageable. Then came COVID. Immigration slowed briefly in 2020, but starting in 2021, the federal government dramatically accelerated immigration targets. In 2022, Canada admitted 437,000 permanent residents. In 2023, 471,000. But those are just permanent residents. Canada also admitted massive numbers of temporary residents. International students increased from 400,000 in 2015 to over 900,000 by 2023. Temporary foreign workers went from 90,000 to over 180,000. When you add it all up, Canada's population grew by over 1.2 million people in 2023 alone. That's a 3% annual population growth rate, the highest in the developed world, the highest in Canadian history outside of the baby boom. Now let's look at what happened to housing supply. In 2006, Canada completed 228,000 new housing units. In 2012, it was 213,000. In 2021, 271,000. And in 2023, it was estimated at 240,000. Notice something here? Despite adding 4.3 million people between 2015 and 2023, Canada built roughly the same number of homes as they did in 2006, when they had 6 million fewer people. The math is simple. If you assume an average household size of 2.5 people, you need about 400,000 new housing units per year to accommodate 1 million people. Canada was building 240,000. The shortfall? About 160,000 units per year. Over 8 years, that's a cumulative shortfall of over 1 million housing units. Canada didn't just fall a bit behind, they created a structural deficit where demand outpaced supply by 40% year after year after year, and the price impact, exactly what you'd expect. The average home price in Canada went from $453,000 in 2015 to $709,000 by early 2024. That's a 56% increase in less than a decade. In Toronto, the increase was 77%. In Vancouver, 62%. In Ottawa, 80%. Even in smaller markets, prices rose 50 to 70%. Rents followed the same trajectory. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Canada's major cities went from $1,100 in 2015 to over $2,000 by 2024. In Toronto and Vancouver, it's higher, $2,400 to $2,600. Now, for context, median household income in Canada grew from $78,000 in 2015 to $92,000 in 2023. That's an 18% increase. Housing prices grew 56%. Rents grew 82%. Income went up 18%. Housing costs went up 50 to 80%. That's the crisis. So how did Canada, a country known for competent governance and careful planning, end up in this situation? The answer involves several policy decisions that individually seemed reasonable, but combined, they created disaster. Decision 1, dramatically increase immigration targets. In 2015, when Justin Trudeau's Liberal government came to power, they increased immigration targets from about 260,000 per year to 300,000. The rationale was economic growth, labor force needs, and Canada's tradition as an immigrant nation. By 2020, targets were increased to 341,000. Then, in 2021, the government announced a new plan, 411,000 in 2022, 421,000 in 2023. 451,000 by 2025. But those were just the official targets. Actual admissions exceeded targets. And critically, the government also massively expanded temporary resident programs without counting them in the official immigration numbers. International student visas were handed out at an unprecedented rate. Universities and especially private colleges became what people started calling visa mills, admitting students not for education quality, but for revenue. Many of these students weren't primarily in Canada to study. They were there to work and try to transition to permanent residence. Temporary foreign worker permits similarly exploded. Employers claimed they couldn't find Canadian workers and were granted permits to bring in workers, often at wages below what would attract domestic labor. The government made these decisions explicitly. They believed immigration was necessary for economic growth, to offset an aging population, to fill labor shortages. Decision 2, fail to build housing. At the same time, immigration was accelerating. Housing construction was constrained by multiple factors. First, municipal zoning regulations. Canadian cities, particularly Toronto and Vancouver, have some of the most restrictive zoning in the developed world. About 70% of residentially zoned land in Toronto is restricted to single-family homes. You literally cannot build apartments or even duplexes in most of the city. Vancouver is similar. The vast majority of residential land is zoned exclusively for detached houses. This was fine when population grew slowly. It's a disaster when you're adding hundreds of thousands of people per year to a metropolitan area. Second, the approval process for new housing is incredibly slow. It can take 3 to 5 years just to get approval for a new development, then another 2 to 3 years to build. By the time a project responds to demand, the market has changed entirely. Third, labor and material costs exploded. Construction labor shortages drove up costs. Lumber prices spiked during COVID. Interest rates rose from near 0 to 5%, making construction financing expensive. And fourth, there's NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. Existing homeowners fight new development because they benefit from scarcity. Their home values rise when supply is constrained. Local residents show up to city council meetings to oppose new apartments. They claim it will change the character of the neighborhood, increase traffic, block views. The federal government understood there was a housing supply problem. They announced various programs, incentives for first-time buyers, funding for affordable housing, agreements with provinces to encourage construction. But these were marginal interventions. They didn't address the core problems. restrictive zoning, slow approvals, a construction industry that physically couldn't scale fast enough. Decision 3, keep going despite the warning signs. And here's where the policy failure becomes inexcusable. By 2022, it was obvious there was a severe housing crisis. Prices had already increased dramatically. Rents were soaring. Homeless encampments were appearing in cities. There were news stories every single week about people being rent-evicted or unable to find housing. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, a federal agency, published reports warning that Canada needed to build 3.5 million additional homes by 2030. Just to restore affordability to 2004 levels, that's 350,000 per year, far above the actual construction rate of 240,000. Despite this, the federal government not only continued but accelerated immigration. In 2023, Canada admitted 471,000 permanent residents, plus over 800,000 net temporary residents. That's 1.27 million people added in 1 year. Why? Several reasons. Politically, immigration is popular among certain constituencies. Immigrant communities themselves often support higher immigration. Many businesses benefit from higher immigration because it increases labor supply and keeps wages down. Universities rely on international student tuition revenue, which can be 3 to 4 times higher than domestic tuition. And ideologically, there's a belief that immigration is always economically beneficial. This is partly true. Immigration does increase GDP, but it doesn't necessarily increase GDP per capita if you're adding people faster than you're adding productive capacity. The government chose to prioritize immigration targets over housing affordability. They gambled that a housing supply would catch up. It didn't. Let's be very clear about who suffers when housing becomes unaffordable. Number 1, young Canadians. If you're under 35 in Canada today, home ownership is increasingly out of reach unless you have family wealth. In 1980, the average home in Toronto cost 5 times the average household income. Today, it's 13 times. That's not a marginal change. That's a structural shift that locks out an entire generation. To afford an average home in Toronto at $1.1 million with a 20% down payment, you'd need $220,000 in cash, plus the ability to service an $880,000 mortgage. At 5% interest, that's $58,000 per year in mortgage payments alone, plus property taxes and maintenance. You'd need household income of at least $150,000 to afford that comfortably. The median household income for Canadians under 35, about $85,000. It's mathematically impossible. Even if you give up on home ownership and try to rent, you're spending 40 to 50% of your income on rent in major cities. That leaves little for savings, retirement, or starting a family. The birth rate in Canada has fallen to 1.4 children per woman, well below replacement. Part of this is cultural, but a significant factor is that young people can't afford to have children when they're paying $2,500 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment. Number 2, low-income workers. If you're working a service job, retail, food service, hospitality, you're in an impossible situation. These jobs typically pay $16 to $20 per hour in major Canadian cities. That's $2,800 to $3,500 per month gross, or about $2,300 to $2,900 net after taxes. If rent is $2,000 to $2,400, you're spending 70 to 85% of your income on rent alone. That's before food, before transportation, before anything else. The result? People living 4 to a 1-bedroom apartment, working multiple jobs, or increasingly just leaving. Cities are losing workers in essential services because they can't afford to live where they work. And finally, new immigrants. Here's a bitter irony. The people hurt most by high immigration are recent immigrants themselves. A newcomer to Canada arrives with limited savings, no credit history, no job lined up in many cases. They're competing for housing with everyone else, but they're at a severe disadvantage. Many end up in exploitative situations, crowded rooming houses, illegal basement apartments, housing tied to employment where the employer controls both your job and your home. The promise to immigrants was that Canada offered opportunity and a better life. For many arriving in the last 5 years, they've found a country where they can't afford rent, can't find a family doctor, and are struggling more than they did in their home countries. Immigrant satisfaction with their decision to move to Canada has fallen dramatically. In surveys, recent immigrants are significantly less satisfied than immigrants who arrived a decade ago. The difference? Housing affordability. The housing crisis has created a political crisis. For decades, immigration was a consensus issue in Canada. All major parties supported high immigration. Public opinion was broadly favorable. Canada prided itself on being a multicultural, immigrant-friendly nation. That consensus is breaking. Public opinion polls now show a majority of Canadians believe immigration levels are too high. In 2023, 44% of Canadians said immigration levels should be decreased, the highest in decades. Only 27% said they should be increased. More concerning, there's been a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment. Protests against temporary housing for asylum seekers, social media rhetoric blaming immigrants for housing costs, healthcare wait times, and job competition. This is new for Canada, and it's dangerous because it directs anger at immigrants themselves rather than at the policy decisions that created the problem. The reality is that individual immigrants didn't cause this crisis. They made rational personal decisions to seek better opportunities. The crisis was caused by federal policy that admitted people at a rate that exceeded the country's ability to house them. But politically, the nuance gets lost. People see neighborhoods changing rapidly. They can't afford rent. And they blame immigration. Right-wing populist movements are gaining traction in Canada for the first time in generations. The Conservative Party has shifted its rhetoric. Provincial governments are clashing with the federal government over immigration levels. The housing crisis isn't just an economic problem, it's eroding social cohesion and the multicultural consensus that defined modern Canada. So we come to the central question. Can Canada fix this crisis? The answer depends on your time frame and your definition of fix. In the short term, 1 to 3 years? No, you cannot build your way out of a 1 million unit housing shortfall in 2 years. Construction takes time. Even if Canada approved 400,000 new units tomorrow, it would take 3 to 5 years for them to be completed and occupied. The only short-term solution would be to dramatically cut immigration to near zero for several years, allowing the existing housing stock to catch up. But this is politically difficult and economically disruptive. Many industries now depend on immigrant labor. Universities depend on international student revenue. The federal government has announced it will lower immigration targets for 2025 to 2027, but the reductions are modest, from 485,000 to 395,000. That still adds nearly 400,000 people per year, while building only 240,000 housing units. The math still doesn't work. In the medium term, 5 to 10 years? Maybe. If Canada implements aggressive policy changes, the crisis could be significantly improved within a decade. Here's what would be required. First, maintain lower immigration levels, not zero, but 200 to 250,000 per year, below the housing construction rate, until the deficit is eliminated. Second, dramatically reform zoning. Cities need to upzone residential areas to allow mid-rise, apartments, multiplexes, and higher density. This is beginning to happen. Ontario recently passed legislation requiring cities to allow up to 3 units on any residential lot, but enforcement and implementation remain uncertain. Third, streamline approvals. The 3 to 5 year approval process needs to be cut to 12 to 18 months. This requires overriding local opposition and empowering provincial governments to bypass municipal foot dragging. Fourth, public investment. The federal government needs to directly fund social housing construction. Private developers build market rate and luxury units because that's where profit is. Affordable housing requires subsidies. Fifth, temporarily restrict housing as an investment vehicle. Some countries have implemented foreign buyer bans or vacancy taxes to prevent housing from being treated purely as a financial asset rather than shelter. If all of these policies were implemented aggressively and sustained for a decade, Canada could add 350 to 400,000 units per year, eventually closing the gap. But that's a big if. Each of these policies faces fierce opposition. Homeowners oppose upzoning because it reduces their property values. Municipalities fight provincial override of their planning authority. The construction industry has limited capacity to scale, and any government that slashes immigration below 300,000 faces accusations of racism and betraying Canada's immigrant identity. In the long term, 10 to 20 years? Probably. Over 2 decades, Canada can realistically build enough housing to restore some level of affordability, assuming they commit to sustained policy reform. But restored affordability doesn't mean returning to 2010 prices. The price increases that have already occurred are mostly permanent. You might stabilize prices at current levels. You might see modest declines in some markets. But a $1.1 million home in Toronto isn't going back to $600,000. What you can achieve is making housing affordable for median income families again. Instead of homes costing 13 times income, you get them back to 7 or 8 times. That's still expensive historically, but it's workable. The bigger question is political will. Can Canada sustain difficult, unpopular policies for 20 years? History suggests that's rare. Governments change, priorities shift, short-term pressures overwhelm long-term planning. Canada's housing crisis is an instructive case study for other countries facing similar pressures. You cannot treat them independently. If you're going to admit large numbers of people, you must simultaneously ensure housing supply can accommodate them. Canada didn't do this. They set immigration policy at the federal level without coordinating with provincial and municipal governments responsible for housing. Canada's population grew 3% in a single year. That's too fast for infrastructure, services, and housing to adapt. Even countries that want high immigration need to pace it to match their capacity to integrate newcomers. Restrictive single-family zoning is incompatible with population growth. If your cities are mostly locked to single-family homes, you cannot accommodate growth without massive sprawl. Dense, walkable neighborhoods require mid-rise apartments and mixed-use development. Canada's cities are only beginning to accept this. Canada is a wealthy country. They have the financial resources to build housing. What they lack is the political will to override local opposition, reform zoning, and prioritize housing supply over homeowner wealth. The housing crisis is turning Canadians against immigration in ways that decades of multicultural policy couldn't prevent. When people can't afford housing, they look for someone to blame. Immigrants are an easy target, even though they're not the cause. This is the real danger. Canada built a successful multicultural society over 50 years. A decade of housing policy failure is threatening to unravel it. Here's the uncomfortable truth that Canadian policymakers avoided for too long. You cannot have unrestricted population growth, restrictive zoning, and housing affordability. You can have 2 of the 3, but not all 3. If you want high immigration and restrictive zoning, housing becomes unaffordable. That's Canada's choice, intentionally or not. If you want high immigration and affordable housing, you need permissive zoning and massive construction. That's what Singapore does. If you want restrictive zoning and affordable housing, you need low population growth. That's what Japan had for decades. Canada tried to have all 3. They wanted high immigration. They maintained restrictive zoning due to political pressure from homeowners. And they promised housing would remain affordable. That was never going to work. The math doesn't allow it. Now they face a generation locked out of home ownership, rising homelessness, political backlash against immigration, and a housing deficit that will take decades to fix, even with perfect policy execution. So, did Canada create an unfixable crisis? Technically, no. With sustained policy reform, lower immigration, aggressive upzoning, streamlined approvals, public investment, the crisis can be improved over 10 to 20 years. But practically, the damage is done. An entire generation has been priced out of home ownership during their prime earning years. They'll never get those years back. Wealth that would have built through home equity is gone forever. The social damage, eroding trust in government, rising anti-immigrant sentiment, declining birth rates, that will take generations to repair, if it can be repaired at all. And politically, there's little evidence Canada has the will to implement the necessary reforms. The federal government has made marginal adjustments. Provinces and cities are fighting over jurisdiction. Homeowners continue blocking new development. The most likely scenario is muddling through. Immigration comes down somewhat, housing construction increases somewhat, prices stabilize but don't fall significantly, affordability improves marginally but never returns to historical norms, and Canada adjusts to being a less affordable country. where homeownership is a privilege for the wealthy rather than an expectation for the middle class. That's not a catastrophic outcome. Canada won't collapse, but it's a significant downgrade in quality of life and opportunity for millions of people. In conclusion, Canada's housing crisis is a masterclass in policy failure. They dramatically increased immigration, the fastest population growth in the developed world. They failed to increase housing supply, building fewer homes in 2023 than in 2006, despite having 6 million more people. They ignored warning signs for years, continuing to accelerate immigration even as prices skyrocketed and experts warned of a shortfall. And now they face consequences that will take decades to resolve: unaffordable housing, political backlash, social division, and a generation financially set back. The question, did Canada create an unfixable crisis, has a nuanced answer. Technically fixable? Yes, with sustained policy reform over 10 to 20 years. Practically achievable? Uncertain, given political constraints and vested interests. Reversible damage? No. The harm to young Canadians who lived through their prime earning years unable to build wealth is permanent. Canada's crisis teaches us that immigration and housing aren't separate issues. They're deeply connected, and you cannot set one policy without considering the other. Countries looking at Canada's experience should take note. This is what happens when you prioritize immigration numbers without ensuring the infrastructure exists to support them. And for Canadians living through this crisis, the message is clear. Your anger is justified. Your struggles are real, and they were preventable. The crisis wasn't inevitable. It was created by specific policy choices, and those choices have consequences that will echo for generations.